Bostonians killed in a flood of molasses, 21 to be exact, and the date, 1909. The following is a strange story. Seems almost unreal, but it did happen, though in Boston, Massachusetts in 1909. At that time, the Purity Distilling Company was a very going concern, and it had a 50-foot high tank that was filled to near capacity with 2 million gallons of steam-heated molasses. Soon it was to be made into gallons of rum and industrial alcohol. The owners and workers of Purity were unaware of the strange catastrophe that was just a few ticks of the clock away on that warm January day. The first indication of something being wrong came when workers heard banging and tapping sounds coming from the huge tank, and what they were hearing were rivets that held the tank together as they were popping free. Suddenly, the tank burst with 2 million gallons of warm, sticky molasses flowing into the streets of Boston. And it's difficult for me to even imagine that amount. It was estimated that the flow was moving at a fairly swift 35 miles per hour. By the by, the molasses was carrying with it very jagged pieces of the exploding tank, making even more danger for those in its path. And as I stated, that January day in 1909 was unseasonably warm. It was in fact 43 degrees. Had it been the average temperatures for January, the soon-to-be victims would have had plenty of time for warning, but with none, they were caught unaware. The moving mass was an actual 15-foot high wall of brown goo, and it surged into Boston's north end. It was quite destructive, crushing trolley cars, trucks, horses, and carts. It was powerful enough to have knocked some buildings right off from their foundations. Parts of the exploded tank bore into the supports holding up the Atlantic Avenue elevated train, and the steel trestles actually twisted and snapped, with the track collapsing to the ground as the train was approaching. Thankfully, the motorman thought quick and walked to the rear of his train and reversed the engines. The train slowed to a halt and was saved from plunging into the masses of molasses below. The most fatalities that day were at the Public Works building where employees were having lunch. The wall of molasses hit the building so hard that the building was throwing pieces of the building, 150 feet into the air. Another building was torn from its foundations, with apartments in the upper floors collapsing into kindling. It was honestly a tidal wave that swallowed up dozens of people under the churning brown mass. And dozens of people were critically injured by the debris picked up and carried by the sticky mess. Others were simply crushed to death by the heavy molasses. Eventually, the molasses began to cool and congeal, which eventually stopped the tidal wave. The first rescuers on the scene were sailors from a harbor patrol ship named the Nantucket. The sailors plunged right in and began pulling survivors out of the molasses. A total of 21 people were killed, with 150 injured, and in an attempt to clean the mess, crews pumped salt water on it, but together with the molasses, the whole area was inundated with foam. It took months before the streets of Boston were their old familiar selves again. Well, that's it. It's an unusual story, and it's hard for me to even picture that event with the mass of molasses crushing buildings and people to death. Well, thanks for stopping by. Be sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss a single new program here on the Dennis Morrison channel.